Ah, my child, let me tell you about an age when the weary stones whispered and carried the weight of the past. There was a light that pierced through the dark veil of the Middle Ages, Christianity. In a world where great empires had fallen, barbarians ruled, and chaos reigned, a spiritual force was slowly taking shape. A force that would bind not only people's bodies but their souls together. And that bond was the church. But wait, don't immediately imagine ornate walls covered in holy books and pictures of saints. This story isn't about those who built empires by shedding blood on the battlefield. It's about those who built a world by praying, writing, and drawing. You'll come to see that the church was far more than just a building. They didn't just guide people's faith. They changed education, politics, art, and even the smallest details of daily life. On this journey, you'll witness the intelligence of Pope Gregory the Great, the peaceful yet disciplined walls of monasteries, and the rebirth of the barbarian King Clovis in the waters of baptism. You'll bear witness to a revolution you can't see with your eyes, but that echoes through the pages of history books. If you're ready, let's take the first step of this story, for there are many secrets written in the stones of that time, and I have much to share with you. Ah, my child, there was once a magnificent power in the world, the Western Roman Empire. It had vast lands, towering columns, and lands that trembled at the sound of its emperor's voices. But nothing lasts forever, does it? By the end of the 5th century, this mighty empire began to collapse under its own weight. Barbarian invasions, political intrigues, economic weakness, and endless internal conflicts had torn down the columns that once reached for the sky. And then, silence. Do you know what remained when that magnificent empire fell? Chaos. People were left unsure of what to do. Cities were looted, trade routes were cut off, schools closed down. With the fall of Rome, life became a whirlpool of uncertainty for the common folk. And right at that moment, a leadership vacuum emerged. But it wasn't a king coming with sword and shield that filled this gap. It was one who prayed, read holy books, and provided spiritual guidance. The church. Ah, the church. It became a light people could turn to in the darkness of those days. With the fall of the Roman Empire, the church wasn't just a center of faith. It became a key force in reorganizing society. The emperor's thrones may have fallen, but the altar of the church remained. Priests and monks didn't just comfort the souls of the people, they also provided direction, a sense of order. The church was one of the few groups that could read and write. The knowledge lost among the crumbling walls of cities was preserved in the silent rooms of monasteries. The church became an authority even the barbarians obeyed. The Pope didn't just act as a spiritual leader, he began to function as a diplomat, a mediator, and even as a ruler. The void left by the fall of the Western Roman Empire was filled by the church itself. People were searching for a bond to keep them together, a unifying force, and that bond was established through the leadership of the church. Amid the ruins of Rome, the church built a new order. Now let's take a closer look at how these spiritual leaders shaped the world and brought the people together. Are you ready, my child? Because this story echoes not only in history books, but also in the stones and churches of this world, still resonating today. Ah, my dear friend, as we step into these moments of history, we will see just how much difference a leader can make. Today, I will tell you about one of the most important figures in the history of the Church, Pope Gregory the Great, also known as Gregory the Great. His story is not just that of a spiritual leader, but also a diplomat, a reformer, and a guide who led his people from darkness to light. When Gregory became the Pope at the end of the 6th century, the world was still shaken by the echoes of the fall of the Roman Empire. Between the pressure of barbarian tribes, economic instability, and the despair of the people, the Church's power as a guiding force was becoming more and more vital. It was in this exact moment that Gregory's leadership shone like a beacon of salvation. Do you know how order is restored under the guidance of a wise man? Gregory was not just a spiritual leader praying for his people, he was also an excellent strategist and diplomat. He used the church as a negotiating force against the Lombards, who threatened Rome. To protect the people of Rome, he turned not only to prayer but also to peace treaties. This is where Gregory's greatness lies. He was a leader who could provide solutions to both spiritual and worldly problems. Of course, his reforms weren't limited to diplomacy alone. He saw the disorder within the church and rolled up his sleeves to set things right. Monastic reforms were among his greatest legacies. At that time, monasteries were not only places for prayer and worship, but also centers of knowledge and culture. Gregory reorganized the discipline and functioning of monks and the pagans. Ah, my child, Gregory's efforts to Christianize pagan communities are another example of his determination and vision. He chose not to convert pagans by force, but with patience and understanding. He wrote letters, sent missionaries, and turned pagan temples into Christian churches. But while doing so, he never failed to respect the traditions and beliefs of the people. Adapting pagan festivals into Christian celebrations is a beautiful example of this understanding. Under Gregory's leadership, the church became not just a spiritual authority, but also a political power. His influence was so great that church historians began to call him Magnus, or Great Gregory. He was not just a pope, but the architect of the reconstruction of a civilization. Now let's explore how Gregory's legacy spread and how he transformed the church. Because this story holds not just clues from the past. Ah, my dear friend, now I will take you to the dark and turbulent times of Europe. This era was not only marked by wars and invasions, but also by the slow yet powerful spread of a new faith, Christianity, among barbarian tribes. In this story, a spiritual light managed to find its way even in the shadows of battle axes and swords. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe had fallen under the influence of various barbarian tribes. The Visigoths, the Franks, the Lombards. Each carried different traditions, different ways of life. But in the midst of this chaos, Christianity rose as a unifying force. So, how did this faith spread among tribes that thrived on war and division? The answer lies in the church's patient strategies and the selfless spiritual leaders. There is a legend about the day Saint Augustine first set foot in England. He was sent by Pope Gregory the Great with a group of missionaries to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Yes, those lands were initially harsh and cold, much like the hearts of its people. However, Augustine's determination and faith gradually softened this harshness. He was not just a teacher, he was also a messenger of peace. He held discussions with the Anglo-Saxon leaders, shared the teachings of Christianity, and baptized the people, introducing them to the faith. Of course, Augustine was not alone. Across Europe, figures like Saint Patrick were also engaged in similar efforts. Saint Patrick waged a legendary battle to convert the pagan people of Ireland to Christianity. The stories he told simplified the complex aspects of Christianity, making them more understandable to the people. For example, the three-leaf clover became a symbol of Christianity in Ireland because Patrick used it to explain the Holy Trinity. But my dear friend, the Church's most powerful tool in this process was not the sword, but patience and understanding. The missionaries did not seek to destroy the traditions and cultures of the barbarian tribes, but rather blended Christianity with these traditions. Pagan festivals gained new meanings in Christianity. Old temples were turned into churches. This shows that the transformation of a religion is not only theological, but also a cultural assimilation process. Christianity also spread with the support of leaders. The baptism of King Clovis of the Franks is one of the most important moments in European history. This event was not just the conversion of one king, but the beginning of an entire people embracing Christianity. The king's decision laid the foundation for a new alliance between the church and the state. So, my dear friend, this is how Christianity spread. Slowly, steadily, and with understanding, into the darkest corners of Europe. This story shows us how the power of faith can play a unifying role, not just as spiritual guidance, but also in the building of a civilization. Now, are you ready to learn how the spiritual leaders' legacy shaped the world they left behind? because our story is just beginning. Ah, my dear friend, now I will take you into the depths of silence, peace, and devotion. This is not a story about the chaos of battlefields, nor about the intrigues of kings. It is a story of an inner journey. We will talk about the birth of the monasteries and their radical impact on Western Europe. The roots of monastic life go back to the first centuries of Christianity. Early Christian monks retreated to the desert to purify themselves from worldly pleasures and to be closer to God. This life of seclusion was first born in the sand dunes of Egypt. Names like Saint Anthony were these early spiritual pioneers who found peace in solitude. But these individual endeavors took on a new form when they moved to Western Europe. By the 6th century, these solitary spiritual lives were united by a sense of order and community. And it is here that the name of Saint Benedict appears on the scene. Benedict is credited with laying the foundations of modern monastic life. Benedict of Nursia wrote a work called the Benedictine Rule as a guide for a community of monks. It was not only a guide to spiritual life, but also a blueprint for how a community should be organized. Ah, the Benedictine Rule. It brought order to the chaotic and disorderly life of that time. Ora et labora, meaning pray and work, was at its heart. Monastic life was to be not only a life dedicated to God, but also a life of service to society. Monks spent their days praying, working, and learning. With this understanding, monasteries became islands of peace, a refuge for those fleeing the war and turmoil of the outside world. The Benedictine Rule was based on discipline and harmony. The monks' days were meticulously organized according to the hours of prayer. At certain times of each day, they prayed, read sacred texts, and engaged in physical labor. This work was usually in areas that benefited society, such as agriculture, copying, writing, and practicing medicine. In this way, monasteries were not only spiritual centers, but also guardians of science and culture in the dark ages of Western Europe. Imagine, my dear friend, that in the midst of wars, invasions, and turmoil, these monasteries shone like beacons of knowledge. Amidst destroyed cities and libraries, monks copied and preserved ancient texts. This was not limited to religious texts. The works of Greek philosophers and the records of Roman historians also found new life in these quiet refuges. Saint Benedict's vision not only created a spiritual journey, but also shaped the cultural and social fabric of Europe. The Benedictine Rule inspired other monastic orders in the following centuries: Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians. Each is a different reflection of Benedict's legacy. And so, my dear friend, this quiet and devotional world of monasteries continued to shine as a light even in the darkest times of Western Europe. This story is not just an individual devotion, but a silent force that holds society together. So, why don't we delve deeper into the impact of this quiet revolution in the next story? Because I have so much more to tell. Ah, my dear friend, I will now take you back to a period in Europe's history when the seeds of a radical change were being sown. After the fall of Rome's glorious imperial order, a different structure slowly began to sit on the vacant throne of power. These were the first shoots of what we know today as the feudal system. But this system was not only based on lords and peasants. The church became one of the spiritual and material cornerstones of this structure. The first traces of the feudal system began to take shape in the 5th and 6th centuries with the fall of Rome. The order of the empire had fallen apart. Roads, cities, and infrastructure had been neglected. People living in chaos and insecurity needed an authority to protect them. Local lords and warriors filled this void. But this story was written not only with the power of sword and shield, but also with spiritual authority. The church offered much more than ordinary spiritual guidance during this period. The church, seen as God's representative on earth, began to permeate every aspect of people's lives. This was not only a spiritual influence, but also a material power, for the church was becoming a land-owning institution. Ah, my friend, imagine. All over Europe, rich lords and nobles were donating their land to the church in the hope that their sins would be forgiven, or that a place in heaven would be opened for them. These donations soon turned the church into a land-owning giant. Monasteries, cathedrals, and dioceses commanded vast tracts of land, and with the peasants who worked them, they were a major economic force. But the church was not only a landowner, it also played a key role in the functioning of the feudal system. Imagine that the feudal system was based on a system of contracts. Lords gave land to their vassals and demanded loyalty and military service in return. The church gave spiritual legitimacy to these contracts. Popes, bishops, and priests ensured that these vows were made in the presence of God and blessed these loyalties. The power of the church was not only earthly but also in the afterlife. Feudal lords could not fully assert their authority over the people without the approval of the church. The legitimacy of a lord, even a king, was shaped by the support of the church. Therefore, when the first steps of the feudal system were taken, the church made its presence felt as an arbiter, a guide and a center of power. Monasteries and cathedrals were not only centers of worship but also influential places in the economy and politics. Monasteries were pioneers in the development of agriculture. Modern agricultural techniques and innovations were born in these sacred places. Cathedrals were not only architectural masterpieces, but also symbols of power and splendor. In every stone you can see how the church was woven into the fabric of the feudal structure. In conclusion, my dear friend, the role of the church in this period was not only spiritual but also political and economic power. The feudal structure was unthinkable without the blessing and guidance of the church. In this way, the Dark Ages of Europe became a period in which the church and the feudal order were intertwined. Oh, there are so many more stories to tell, my dear friend. We will continue to explore in more depth how the church put its stamp on the feudal structure, as one by one the stones of the feudal order fell into place. In the next story, we will talk about how this order became more complex and influential. Ah, my dear friend, I will now take you back to the depths of the Middle Ages, when the church became not only a spiritual but also a social order-shaping institution. This is the story of how knowledge and law were reshaped at the hands of the church. If you are ready, let us first embark on the illuminating journey of education. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe entered a dark period. The glorious knowledge of the ancient Greek and Roman civilizations was almost lost in the chaos of barbarian invasions. But, my dear friend, it was precisely in this dark period that the monasteries shone like a beacon of light. Monasteries were not only centers of spiritual worship, but also sacred places where knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Inside these monasteries, educational centers called monastic schools were established. It was in these schools that the clergy educated young people, teaching them basic subjects such as reading, writing, and theology. But this education was not only for spiritual purposes. The church also aimed to create a moral and intellectual foundation that would hold society together. The monasteries, functioning according to Saint Benedict's rules, became not only centers of learning, but also the heart of writing and copying. The copying of manuscripts was considered one of the most sacred duties of the monasteries. Think of the literary and scientific heritage of ancient Greece and Rome, which we owe to this quiet and meticulous work. With quills in their hands, the monks copied a text and considered every word, every letter, as a service to God. Ah, my friend, we must not forget that monasteries became not only libraries, but also intellectual centers of the time. The study of mathematics, astronomy, and even medicine flourished in these holy places. Monasteries were the places that laid the foundations of Europe's future university system. Let us now embark on a journey from knowledge to power. The Church's influence on the social order was not limited to education. Gradually, the Church also became a shaper of law. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the legal system in Western Europe had almost completely disintegrated. It was based on local customs and the arbitrary decisions of feudal lords. But my dear friend, the Church rose as a stabilizing force in this chaotic order, making its spiritual authority felt also in earthly matters. The Church took the authority to judge in the name of God. Popes and bishops began to rule not only on religious matters, but also on many legal issues affecting daily life. Church courts were established with jurisdiction over a wide range of matters, from marital disputes to inheritance cases, and even criminal and penal matters. At the heart of these courts was the canon law, developed by the Church. Canon law. Seen as the manifestation of a divine order on earth, this legal system aimed to regulate every aspect of human life. The popes and the clergy, as interpreters and enforcers of these laws, shaped society's sense of justice. And, dear friend, the people believed that the judgments handed down in these courts reflected the will of God. But the Church's legal power was not limited to the courts. The popes even tried to establish authority over kings. As we often saw during the Middle Ages, it became almost impossible for a king to ascend to the throne without the approval of a pope. This was one of the peaks of the Church's earthly power. As a result, my friend, the Church was not only an institution that touched the human soul, but also a force that shaped the intellectual and legal order of society. Preserving knowledge through monastic schools and writing, laying the foundations of justice through canon laws, the Church was an integral part of medieval Europe. There is so much more to tell. We will continue to explore the journey of the Church during this period and the ways in which it transformed society. In the next story, we will discuss the deeper details of the rise of the Church as both a spiritual and political power in Europe. If you are ready, my comrade, let us continue this journey. My dear friend, now I will take you to the spiritual depths of the Middle Ages and the traces of the Church in the everyday life of society. We will talk about a system of faith based on the light of the saints and the strengthening of the Church's ties with the people. If you are ready, let's start with the sacred journey of the saint. In medieval Europe, saints were seen as the spiritual guides of the people, their protectors even beyond their lifetime. They were perceived as a bridge between God and people. Their lives, miracles, and sacrifices inspired deep admiration and devotion among the people. The stories of the saints not only elevated the souls of the faithful, but were also used by the Church as a tool of spiritual power. Biographies of the lives of the saints were full of stories embellished with miraculous events. Saint Benedict, for example, reshaped monastic life as a monk and became known for his miracles. Many saints like him found their place in the prayers of the people. The saints calmed their fears and kept their hopes alive in their daily lives. The belief in relics, sacred objects believed to belong to the saints, added another depth to this devotion. The bones of the saints, their clothes, or the objects they had touched were seen as sacred treasures. Churches competed with each other for possession of these relics, and some even invented legends about holy bones to attract the public's attention. These relics not only carried a spiritual value but also contributed greatly to the economy of the churches. A church's possession of relics made it a pilgrimage center. Pilgrims from all over Europe would make long journeys to see and touch these sacred objects. And during these journeys, my dear friend, the churches received considerable income from donations and various services. The relics filled not only the souls, but also the treasury of the church. Now, my dear friend, let me take you back to the countryside, to the days when farmers sweated at the plow. The church was central not only to the life of the nobility, but also to that of the peasants. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church was at the heart of rural life. The church bells set not only the hours of worship, but also the rhythm of daily life. Farmers timed the harvest according to the church's sacred calendar and gathered their crops in prayer. The church was not only their spiritual guide, but also the guardian of social order. But this devotion came at a price. Zakat and taxes were the debts farmers owed to the church. Every year they had to give a portion of their crops to the church. This was seen as part of their debt to God. But my dear friend, it was not just an economic burden. It was also a system that reinforced the dependence of the farmers on the church. For rural people, the church was both a source of hope and an authority. Land ownership was another factor that increased the church's influence over the rural population. Within the feudal order, the church owned large tracts of land, and the peasants working on these lands served the church with both their physical labor and their spiritual devotion. The church ruled over these lands like a monarch, shaping the daily life of the... Ah, my friend, these dynamics in the life of the farming people show that the church is not only a spiritual force, but also a social and economic building block. The church had become an indispensable element of medieval Europe, on this fine line between faith and work, between the sacred and the profane. In our next story, I will tell you about the deepening influence of the church and how Europe was transformed by this spiritual force. If you are ready, my friend, our journey will continue. Ah, my dear friend, in the yellowed pages of history books, in an age of brute force, Christianity began to spread in the most unexpected ways. In this story of the intersection of power and faith, the conversion of barbarian kings to Christianity was a turning point that radically changed the fate of Europe. I will now tell you the story of the Frankish king Clovis, whose journey was both glorious and deeply meaningful. At the end of the 5th century, Clovis was a powerful leader with dreams of uniting the tribes and building an empire. But my friend, Clovis's story was not only shaped in the shadow of the sword. What made his reign different was that it was also crowned with a spiritual transformation. Clovis was initially a pagan ruler. Gods and nature spirits filled his world. However, in a twist of fate, on a battlefield, everything changed. According to legend, Clovis was fighting a great battle against the Alemanni tribe when he felt he was on the brink of defeat. At that moment, he begged not to the pagan gods, but to the God of the Christians. "If I win this battle, I will walk in your way," he is said to have said. And miraculously, the battle turned in his favor. After his victory, Clovis kept his promise, converted to Christianity, and was baptized. But, dear friend, this conversion was not just a spiritual epiphany. Clovis's baptism must also be interpreted as a political strategy. By embracing Christianity, Clovis not only united the Frankish tribes, but also claimed the spiritual legacy left behind by Rome. This gave his leadership a kind of divine legitimacy. He was no longer just a king, but a ruler blessed by God. Clovis's example became a model for other barbarian leaders in Europe. By embracing Christianity, the leaders of tribes such as the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Lombards not only achieved unity among their people, but also the spiritual authority of the church. This strategic transformation enabled Christianity to be perceived not only as a religion, but also as a source of power. Barbarian kings sought to put their rule on a firmer footing by forming alliances with the church. The church offered spiritual support to these leaders, and in return undertook the mission of Christianizing their populations. It was a lucrative deal for both sides. But my dear friend, this story is not only about profit and strategy. The conversion of the barbarian leaders to Christianity also brought about a cultural transformation of their peoples. Pagan rituals gave way to Christian worship. The old gods were forgotten, while saints and holy figures took their place. This created a fundamental change in the spiritual fabric of societies. The Christianization of Clovis and other barbarian leaders ushered in a new era in European history. These leaders used the spiritual power of the church to consolidate their political authority. Thus, a strong bond was forged between the barbarian kingdoms and the church. Ah, my friend, few things in history have changed the souls of peoples and the face of politics as much as the conversion of Clovis. This story reminds us once again how great power can lie at the intersection of faith and politics. In our next story, I will tell you how these bonds created an imperial order and changed the spiritual map of Europe. If you are ready, we will pick up where we left off on this long journey. My dear friend, I will now tell you the story of the subtle and fragile relationship between the papacy, the spiritual leader of the West, and Byzantium, the glorious empire of the East. It was the beginning of a long journey of power, faith, and sometimes conflict. To understand the first traces of that period when the Eastern and Western churches parted ways, let us review the historical scene together. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the papacy quickly filled the vacuum of spiritual leadership in Europe. But my dear friend, filling this vacuum was both an opportunity and a challenge for the papacy. For the papacy was not the only power to lay claim to Rome's legacy. In the East, the Byzantine Empire had also claimed Rome's legacy and defined itself as the new Rome. While the papacy united the people in the West, Byzantium ruled the eastern part of the Christian world with a strong imperial structure. But these two powers acted as unequal partners. Byzantium saw itself as both the worldly and spiritual leader. The emperor was considered not only a ruler, but also God's representative on earth. This posed a big problem for the papacy, because in the West, the Pope was perceived as the supreme figure of spiritual authority. This triggered a never-ending power struggle between East and West. Ah, my friend, it was not only the power struggle that damaged this relationship. Differences in the interpretation of beliefs and religious practices deepened the conflict between the papacy and Byzantium. The Eastern Church treated Christian theology as a philosophical discipline, engaging in deep debates about the nature of God and the relationship between Jesus' humanity and divinity. The Western Church, on the other hand, took a more practical approach, focusing on meeting the religious needs of the people. Over time, these different approaches led to serious differences between the rituals and theological doctrines of the two churches. The iconoclasm movement was one of the most important turning points in this divergence. The ban on the use of icons or religious images in the Byzantine Empire led to a deep rift with the Western Church. While the Pope argued that icons should be considered sacred, the Byzantine emperor claimed that they could lead to idolatry. This debate represented not only a religious but also a political divide. My dear friend, the papacy was not going to accept this Byzantine authority over its spiritual leadership. But the weakness of the West prevented the break with Byzantium for a long time. The popes had to pursue diplomatic efforts to gain military and political support. But from the 8th century onwards, a new power began to emerge in the West, the Franks. The Pope formed an alliance with the Franks to reduce his dependence on Byzantium. This alliance was crowned in 800 when Charlemagne was declared Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. This event dealt a heavy blow to relations between Byzantium and the papacy. The East considered only its own emperor worthy of the title, and so Charlemagne's coronation was a breaking point between East and West. Ah, my friend, these relations between the papacy and Byzantium paved the way for the formal division of the Eastern and Western churches, known in history as the Great Schism. This schism was not only a political and theological rupture, it was also the beginning of the spiritual and cultural evolution of the Christian world into two different paths. And so, while in the East the majestic domes of Byzantium rose, in the West the papacy was building its own spiritual empire. This story is a lesson in how power and faith intersect and sometimes clash. In the next installment, we will discuss the events that deepened this divide and the great rupture that changed the Christian world forever. If you are ready, let's continue our journey. Ah, my dear friend, let me tell you about a clever strategy the Church used. This strategy wasn't about completely erasing old beliefs, but transforming them, giving them new meanings. In this part of history, you'll learn how Christianity absorbed pagan traditions, how it shaped old symbols and rituals into something new. Listen and marvel at the craftsmanship of history. Pagan traditions had deep roots all across Europe. These traditions shaped not only people's beliefs, but also their way of life, social structures, and how they perceived the cycles of the year. When Christianity entered this world, instead of clashing with pagan beliefs, it chose to use them as a bridge. Because, my friend, a smart leader knows the direct way to win the people's hearts. And the Church knew this well. For example, the pagan holiday celebrating the winter solstice was reinterpreted as Christmas in Christianity. For the people of Northern Europe, this holiday symbolized the victory of light over darkness and the renewal of nature. By placing the birth of Jesus on this date, the Church gave the old rituals new meaning. People didn't have to abandon their old traditions completely. They were now reborn under the light of Christianity. Ah, my friend, symbols, silent but powerful storytellers of human history. The Church took pagan symbols and infused them with new religious meanings, making familiar images serve Christianity. For example, the evergreen tree. In ancient pagan beliefs, this tree represented eternal life and the renewal of nature. Christianity made the evergreen tree a symbol of Christmas, tying it to the celebration of Jesus' birth. Similarly, mistletoe, a plant considered sacred by pagans, was given new meaning. Once a symbol of peace and protection, it was now reinterpreted as a symbol of love and unity in Christianity. Likewise, pagan symbols representing the sun began to symbolize God's light and the enlightenment Jesus brought to the world in Christianity. As old temples were transformed into Christian churches, these symbols were often preserved and redefined in the new structures. Christianity didn't just reshape symbols, it also gave new spiritual meanings to pagan rituals. In pagan communities, the arrival of spring and harvest seasons were celebrated with great festivals. The Church incorporated these celebrations into its religious calendar. For example, pagan festivals celebrating the arrival of spring were merged with Easter. Easter in Christianity represents the resurrection of Jesus, and the spirit of spring's renewal aligned perfectly with this message. Similarly, pagan ceremonies honoring the dead were redefined as All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Eve in Christianity. The roots of what we now celebrate as Halloween lie in the harmony between these old traditions and Christianity. Ah, my dear friend, the Church didn't just seek to rule over beliefs. It chose to understand their language and work in harmony with them. Instead of wiping out pagan traditions, it placed them in the service of Christianity. In doing so, it built a bridge between the old world and the new. This strategy helped Christianity rise not just as a religion, but also as a cultural and social force. The rebirth of old traditions with new meanings shows us once again how history is a constantly changing and evolving process. In the next section, we'll take a deeper look at the Church's influence on the people. If you're ready, our journey continues. Ah, my dear friend, history shows us that power is not only fueled by faith, but also by the economy. One of the cornerstones of the Church's power was the immense wealth created through taxes and donations collected from the faithful. Today, I will tell you how the Church rose as an economic power, how it managed this wealth, and the impact it had on society. If you're ready, let's turn the dusty pages of time. Ah, the people. These individuals, deeply devoted to their faith, believed that supporting the Church was a duty in the eyes of God. At the heart of the Church's wealth were taxes called tithes, taken from the people. Farmers would give 1/10 of their harvest to the Church, artisans would set aside a portion of their earnings, and nobles would donate a percentage of the income from their lands. This system wasn't just a material obligation, it was also seen as a spiritual act. By contributing to the Church, the people hoped to secure a place in heaven. Similarly, those who believed they had committed great sins would make donations to cleanse their souls, sometimes even giving all their wealth to the Church. That's why the Church's coffers were often overflowing with gold, silver, and precious stones. My dear friend, the Church's economic power didn't only rely on the taxes and donations from the people. Monasteries were the heart and engine of this economic structure. These sacred places were also large agricultural enterprises. The vast lands owned by the monasteries were worked by peasants, and the produce flowed into the Church's treasury. Monasteries played a significant role not only in agriculture but also in trade. They were active in industries such as wool production, winemaking, and even paper making. Goods produced in monasteries were sold in local markets, and this income further increased the Church's wealth. However, Don't forget that monasteries were not just economic centers, they were also places of innovation and knowledge. Especially in agriculture, the development of more efficient methods and the application of new technologies often started in monasteries before spreading to the general public. Control over trade routes was another factor that strengthened the church's economic power. Ah, my dear friend, remember that the church's eyes were not only on souls, but also on the wealth brought by trade. The church would collect taxes from merchants under the guise of protecting trade routes, and take a share of the goods passing through ports and markets. In addition, merchants would collaborate with monasteries to serve pilgrims traveling to the holy city of Jerusalem and other pilgrimage sites. This partnership increased profits for both the church and the merchants. While expanding its economic power, the church also reinforced the spiritual authority of the pilgrimage sites. Ah, my dear friend, the church's wealth wasn't just a source of power, it was also a point of contention. In the eyes of the people, this wealth sometimes made the church appear not just as a gateway to heaven, but also as a worldly authority. While the church used this wealth for building grand cathedrals, supporting works of art, and helping the poor, it also spent it on forging political alliances to strengthen its power. However, this wealth eventually led to criticisms that the church was becoming too worldly and straying from its original purpose. The church's economic power allowed it to rise not only as a spiritual leader, but also as a temporal authority. However, this power came with responsibilities and criticisms. The church sometimes had to resort to reforms to maintain this balance. Ah, my dear friend, here's one of the most important lessons history teaches us. Power and wealth can only move a society forward when used in the right hands and for the right purposes. During this time, the church managed to be both a light and a shadow. In the next section, we will continue to explore this story in more depth. Are you ready? Ah, my dear friend, today I will tell you the story of one of the church's most powerful weapons, excommunication. Now, sit back, take a deep breath, and close your eyes, for I will take you to a time when people trembled in fear and kings bowed down. Excommunication, can you feel the weight of the word? It meant not only being cast out from the community, but also being deprived of God's grace. A person who was excommunicated was cut off from the protection of the church and all religious rights, becoming an outcast in the eyes of the people. The most terrifying part of this punishment was that it didn't just threaten one's earthly life, it also threatened their afterlife. For when someone was excommunicated, it was believed that their soul could not reach heaven. This is why excommunication was a nightmare not just for individuals, but for kings and leaders as well. My dear friend, as history has shown us, the church used this punishment as a tool of control, not just for the common folk, but also for kings. Ah, imagine this. You are a great king with armies at your command, vast lands and power. But one morning you hear that the Pope has excommunicated you. This means not just you, but all your people are now cut off from the church. Your people panic because they can no longer go to church, attend services, or even confess their sins. Faith was so central to their lives that living even a single day without the church's protection was terrifying. And it is this fear, my friend, that brought kings to their knees, making the Pope's power greater than anything else. But excommunication alone was not enough, my friend. The church had created a complex system of punishment to control society. The church courts dealt not only with religious matters, but also with secular crimes. In these courts, it was believed that decisions were made in God's name. The accused were often charged with acting against the church's doctrines. Heretics, those who deviated from the teachings, were interrogated, tortured, and often sentenced to harsh punishments. But these courts weren't just for punishment. They were also used to spread fear throughout the people. Imagine those dark chambers, my friend. Picture someone being interrogated under the cold stares of the court, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls. a confession, an apology, or a public display of repentance. That was what the church wanted from its people. In this way, the church succeeded not only in controlling individuals, but also in controlling society as a whole. My dear friend, the church's system of punishment was based on fear, but this was a fear intertwined with faith. People chose to obey, follow the rules, and remain loyal to the church, rather than face excommunication or being judged in the church courts. However, this also became a major point of debate. The church's power was questioned. Was it truly spiritual, or was it simply an instrument to strengthen worldly control? People began to wonder whether these punishments were based on real spiritual authority, or just a way to solidify the church's power. My friend, history always shows us a two-faced coin. The church's system of punishment maintained order but also imposed oppression. Excommunication made the church an unquestionable authority, but it also led to questioning that authority. Remember, power and fear cannot coexist forever. At some point, people either rebel or they accept the pressure and change. The church's system of punishment was one of its most powerful tools, but it also laid the foundation for many conflicts and debates. In the next story, we'll talk about how this authority evolved and how the people resisted this fear. Are you ready, my dear friend? And my dear friend, today I will tell you how Christianity united the fragmented lands of Europe. Imagine this, lands that were fiercely bound by their own kingdoms and tribal traditions, separated by different languages and cultures. Europe in chaos. And yet, amidst this turmoil, Christianity emerged like a guiding light from the heavens. Christianity became a unifying force across the vast expanse of Europe. Think about it, people speaking different languages, with different traditions, but all calling upon God in the same prayers, in the same rituals. This wasn't just a belief, it became the foundation of a shared culture. The teachings of the church ensured that everyone adhered to the same moral and spiritual values. No matter which kingdom you were born in, you believed in the same Bible and participated in the same rituals. This created a unifying effect, from the smallest village to the grandest palace. People began to see themselves as part of a larger community, thanks to Christianity. But, my dear friend, Christianity's influence was not confined to the spiritual realm. Church leaders developed strategies that reshaped Europe's political map. Popes were not only religious leaders, they were diplomats and politicians. When a king wanted to go to war with another king, he could not act without the Pope's approval. The Church played a central role in forming alliances, drawing borders, and even in the coronation ceremonies of kings. Picture the coronation. When the Pope places a crown on a king's head, it symbolized not only the king's service to his people, but also his service to God. The unifying power of the Church was felt not only between kings but also among the people. The Church spread rules like the peace of God to preserve peace and order. These rules sought to limit wars and conflicts, ensuring that people lived in peace within the framework of their faith. Under the Church's leadership, the unity of Europe slowly took shape. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church became not only a spiritual authority, but also a pillar of social and economic structure. The Church fostered knowledge through schools, production through monasteries, and diplomacy through peace-building. The Church became a bridge that connected different nations. Pagan tribes, as they encountered Christianity, abandoned their old traditions and became part of a new European identity. The Church's role in this process was like that of a conductor, orchestrating a grand symphony. Every king, every tribe, every people became part of this orchestra. Sacramento, my friend, Christianity flowed not only through the hearts of the faithful, but through the very veins of Europe. The lands it united grew stronger, and together they formed a greater civilization. Yet, this unity came at a cost. Conflicts, disagreements, and divisions were also part of this story. As I conclude this tale, I ask you to reflect. Did this unity of Europe only bring people together, or did it in some ways limit them? My dear friend, in this long journey we have traced the footprints of Christianity. Now, as I close the pages of this story, remember that history is an endless cycle. Understanding the stories of the past helps us shape our future. In our next meeting, I will be here to illuminate another facet of history. For now, rest, reflect, and absorb what you've learned.